there's a very nice collection of essays from the Comper Center outside. You're welcome to pick one up. We put it together for the second anniversary of October 7th. Antisemitism 2 years after October 7th. And I contributed an essay there, and I posed the question, has the West crossed a Rubicon in terms of anti-Semitism? And I posed it at the time as a question in the essay I wrote here, and now, about 6 months later, I kind of have an answer, and I'm afraid the answer is yes. And that has a lot of implications, because I know as someone who grew up in the United States, but who's lived here for many years, it's not the same. And the question is, can you go home again in terms of the climate and the atmosphere? And I'm coming to the conclusion that the answer is no, which means that something is shifting fundamentally, certainly in the United States and in other countries. So I want to just take a few minutes to lay out both why I think the Rubicon has been crossed, which is and then to say some of the, to put forward some of the implications for Jewry, both in Israel, but more importantly for the communities abroad. So the first thing I wanted to, I'll actually go through a bunch of reasons that I think the situation has changed. And by the situation has changed is usually when there was an operation in Gaza in the past 2 decades, you'd have a flare-up, let's say, of anti-Semitism, and then things would go back to where they were. So there was sort of a baseline. The baseline was constantly going up, but kind of things went back. Now that baseline has been going up for a variety of reasons, some of which, in fact, the most important of which, has nothing to do with Israel or Jews. But now I believe, after 2.5 years post-October 7th, there is no baseline anymore. That's what I mean by crossing the Rubicon. So we're not going to go back to the way, more or less, the way it was before. I'm referring to communities specifically in the United States, which is the obviously largest diaspora community, but also I'd say sort of leads the world in a cultural and in a wider sense. The UK, Canada, and Australia, the UK and its Commonwealth countries, France and Germany. These are the largest, some of the largest Jewish communities in the world. Argentina, I'm putting aside because things are happening in Latin America which are a little bit different, and Russia. So those are the top communities of Jews in the world. And the heft of them, in my view, are at a point of crossing the Rubicon, and for the following reasons. The first and most important reason, in my view, is that anti-Semitism thrives in a society where there is polarization, where there is social instability, economic instability. It thrives in bad times. And this has nothing to do with Jews or Israel. This just has to do with the society. The United States society is polarized. I mean, it's unbelievable. Life was so boring and nice when I grew up. So that's something, and it's true of all the other. It's true of all the other Western countries I mentioned. Things are going on. The right-left divide. Everything is making it very, very problematic. One of the ways you notice that is what they call it. The horseshoe, where the extreme right and the extreme left are sort of beginning to say the same things on Jews, and that shows you're getting to a point where it's coming from all directions or more directions. It's not coming from an isolated direction. The far right was always anti-Semitic, beseder, but now it's coming from here and there, and it's combined, and it's the same. So that's one thing, and that has nothing to do with Israel or Jews. It doesn't have to do with the government policy. It doesn't have to do with anything, the government of Israel policy. It has to do with what's going on in those societies. The other piece is the university piece, the academy. that's a very, very important piece because that is foundational to Western society, and it's foundational to Jews in Western society. For Jews in the United States and in all these other countries, the university was the stepping stone to success, to advancement, to becoming part of the society. Now, once the life at the university for a Jew is unwelcoming, that fundamentally shifts the trajectory of Jewish success in the West. So the issue around the academy and by extension cultural institutions, which are always home to Jews, and I speak about the United States, publishing houses, Hollywood, these places. This is where Jews really stand out. So that's the second piece, and that's very unique to this time. It again doesn't have to do with Jews or Israel in particular. It's a zeitgeist. It's a different topic, but it's definitely affecting them. Younger adults being more anti-Semitic, less prone, don't have a historical background, don't know what September 11th was. It's a different state out there. Another point in this, why it's not going back, is that there continues to be huge incentive for state and non-state actors to undermine Israel's public standing in the West. Whether it's the BDS movement or Qatar, they have succeeded to a good extent, and they have every incentive now, post-October 7th, to continue their efforts to delegitimize Israel. It's not as if the incentive has gone away. On the contrary, because Israel militarily is showing its strength in the region, the best way to undermine that is not by declaring war on Israel on the military front, but by undermining support for Israel in the West. And they're doing a good job of it. And again, as long as the incentive continues, there's no reason that the dynamic will change. And on top of that, you have Russia and China wanting to foment social unrest. So a anti-Semitic motif like Zionist-occupied government, which is now becoming common, both on the far right and the far left, that's something that China and Russia, they don't care about the Jews, how that affects anti-Semitism. It undermines Western society, it causes wedges, and they, with their army of bots, are going to help move that along. So there's that component. And the final component is the immigrant population from Muslim countries. The anti-Semitic curriculum in Arab countries and in Muslim countries had a dividend that its authors never imagined. And that dividend is paying off in the West today, because the deep-rooted not only anti-Israel but anti-Semitism that was taught to immigrants and in their households, taught to their children, is paying off as Arab and Muslim immigrant and first-generation population have their say now in society and especially in politics. It is the perfect rallying cry. It unites everyone. There's nothing to argue about. It's easy. And that's a good way to start politically for legitimate reasons. So for all those reasons, none of which show any sign of changing their bent at the moment, I think we're in for a fundamental change. Which brings me to sort of some comments on what that looks like in this sort of this concluding part. When I used to travel in Europe 20 years ago as an American Jew, and I saw the armed guards in front of a synagogue, I'm like, whoa, what's going on here? This is like an army fortress. What, I was shocked. It wasn't part of the culture I grew up in, and needless to say, that era is over. So basically what happened in Europe, what happened in France is just 10 years ahead. So I think when, 10 years ago, the rabbi of Marseille was saying, you should take off your kippah for pikuach nefesh because they're terrorists looking to, stab Jews, and there was a debate within France whether you should do that. That debate is relevant for the United States today. So France is just sort of a little bit ahead of the curve. But again, France is getting worse, and I think the situation is getting worse. I think we have to look at Soviet Jewry, although the circumstances there are very different because it's Second World, it's communist, it's beyond the Iron Curtain. But we, as we look forward in this thing, we have to consider real life scenarios and real ways to engage, because again, the trajectory is serious, and we gotta mentally put ourselves there, and that's very, very difficult. As someone coming from the diaspora, we always hope it'll get better, but there's no indication it will. So that gives Jews basically two options. One is to hunker down, and the other is to go strong and to fight it out. And by hunkering down, I mean, and there's so many, ways of expressing this, to take off the symbols that you wear, to ask, by the way, an interesting phenomenon, to ask newspapers, Jewish newspapers, to remove your name from articles you've written, to erase your sort of online Israel or Jewish affiliation, to keep quiet when people say stuff. Hunker down manifests itself in so many ways, and you can just ask anybody who made it through the Soviet period what that means. So that's one way of acting, and by the way, these two ways are not mutually exclusive. The other option is to redouble your effort. Redouble your effort in going strong on Judaism and going strong on Israel. And I mentioned Brett Stevens' address to New York about how not to discuss not to build institutions to fight anti-Semitism, but to build institutions to build Judaism, schools. That's how you strengthen yourself. Before you fight, you've got to be strong. You got to go through the basic training. You got to be ready. You got to be ready here. This whole thing is we're so much focused on the rationale, and that the whole fight is here. And that's one of the things that I learned in my public policy experience, that the focus is wrong. The focus has to be kind of here, in the hearts of the people. And these are people that are working on the hearts of people. So, first of all, it's in the Jewish heart. The heart of the individual Jew, the heart of the collective Jew. And again, the hunker down and fight are not mutually exclusive. In some things people will hunker down, and other things they'll fight. But those are the two sort of modus operandi. And this is something that I think is important. We're at a fluctuation point. So there's a huge opportunity for a Jewish and an Israeli Renaissance. Because it's like, sort of after a forest fire of, let's say, October 7th, the forest has an opportunity to regrow in a different way. And so because of this crisis, because of the crisis both of anti-Semitism having nothing to do with Jews in the West, and because of the crisis October 7th having, nothing to do with the situation of Jews in the West, because these two things have now converged, we have an opportunity, not only a challenge. Maya Tevet Dayan, for those of you who were here Tuesday night at her presentation, she's an example of a rebirth. She's an example of a renaissance, of a woman who had nothing to do with her Judaism, put it aside, wanted to be a universalist, and then October 7th hit her with all the ramifications. She was a professor of poetry in San Diego when it happened, a visiting professor, and she was thrust into it. So there's an opportunity here, and I use that just as an example, of people, both Israelis and Jews, who are refinding themselves. A lot of the people at this conference had no relation academically or otherwise to anti-Semitism before October 7th. We would have filled a third of the space. Because people, academics from other disciplines, are coming to this field because they're like, wait a minute. And so it provides, what David said last night, David Hirsch, there's a lot of work out there, but there are a lot more people there. And I was kind of sad when Dina Porat said, "Oh, look, I proved them right. Anti-Semitism studies is great, is flourishing." Well, I mean, I'm sorry, sorry that's the case. I'm sorry it had to happen, but it is, and there's a silver lining. The silver lining is the growing of the community, especially in the academic setting which we're in today, but in general. And I want to conclude with one last thing, sort of a personal thing. In Chicago, I went to high school at Ida Crown Jewish Academy. And I had a very elderly rabbi there who taught Talmud for 11th and 12th graders. He had survived the Holocaust. And literally, I mean, his family was decimated in the Holocaust. And he moved to the United States after. He survived Auschwitz. He moved to the United States. And on his way to Chicago, he met with another rabbi who had a very sort of esteemed rabbi who had also survived. And my rabbi asked the rabbi, what's the lesson? What do we take away from everything that happened? And the rabbi told him, Emuna, emuna, emuna. Faith, faith, faith. And he held that with him, and he continued his life in that direction. Faith is not something that you can explain here. Faith is something that you have here. And in the sort of warm and fuzzy feeling of this conference, that warm and fuzziness comes from a biyachadness, a faithness, a communityness. That's something that, obviously you can do social science experiments, but it's here. And that's what I wanted to tell us all as we face this.